Good evening. Again, good to see everyone back with us tonight. Hope you've had a good day. It's been a dark day, a dreary day. The cold has come back around. Kind of thrown me off a bit today. It's been warm the last 2 weeks, and the wind's blowing. Feels back like winter again. But it's good to see you out tonight. We've got some smaller numbers tonight, but always very well appreciative of those that we have here. Any visitors we have want to again know that you are our honored guest. As I mentioned this morning, we're going to begin a series tonight. Something I've been thinking about for a little while now, but looking at women of the Bible. And as I mentioned this morning, for some reason or another, I got to thinking about it maybe a couple months ago. And a lot of the times when I look at examples that kind of drop on my points, I typically look at the men of the Bible and not a whole lot of the women themselves, even though we have a lot of stories of women in the Bible that we can look at for examples. And I have done some lessons before on women like Sarah and Ruth. But we're looking at here for the next 2 or 3 months, Lord willing, looking at several women of the Bible. I plan to do this throughout maybe April. So maybe looking at about 6 or 7 lessons in total of different women, both from the Old and New Testament. And so we'll begin a new series tonight, Women of the Bible. We're going to begin with one that has always been more interesting to me, and that is Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is a character of the Bible that's often been misunderstood, misrepresented in some ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the lesson tonight. And there's not a whole lot on Mary Magdalene, but there is enough here to where we get a good idea about who Mary Magdalene was, or at least in regards to her days here on this earth and her faithfulness to Jesus, and of course that translates into her faithfulness to God as well. So we're going to go through tonight looking at Mary Magdalene's importance. I do have all the passages on the board, but as always, if you'd like to open your Bibles and follow along, you're always more than welcome to do that. First of all, we're going to look at who was Mary Magdalene. We don't know a whole lot about this woman in her early life. Where she is first introduced appears to be in Luke chapter 8, verse 1. It says, soon afterwards, Jesus began going around from one city and village to another, proclaiming and preaching the kingdom of God. The 12 men were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sickness. Mary, who was called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing to the support out of their private means. So I did a good bit of research in leading up to this lesson and trying to figure out exactly what was true and what wasn't, and trying to pinpoint certain passages in the New Testament that mentions Mary Magdalene. And as far as I know, this is the first time that where she is ever mentioned. We see here in verse 2 that Mary Magdalene had at one point in time had 7 demons that had gone out of her. And as we look at Mark chapter 16, verse 9, we know that Jesus was the one that cast out those demons. It says, after he had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. So we know that Mary Magdalene was a woman whom Jesus had helped out, had cast out 7 demons from her. So we see an example here of someone that Jesus personally helped out. As we look at the end of verse 3, we also see another part of Mary's contribution here, in that she is no doubt going to be a disciple of Christ. She'll be there with him all the way through the end, and even after his resurrection. But it says here, and many others who are contributing to their support out of their private means, which goes to suggest that Mary Magdalene was supporting Jesus not only in regards to being with him, but apparently even in regards to maybe their private money as well. And it doesn't really say a whole lot more about her up to this point, except for this right here. In that she was someone that Jesus had cast out demons from. She was someone who, as we go forward, is going to appear to be faithful to Jesus. She's going to be one of his disciples, again, all the way through the end. And someone who seemed to be supporting him, possibly even financially. And so this is where she comes from, at least as far as we know. We know nothing else about her in regards to her early life other than this. And I couldn't really find anything else about her until we get to the end of Jesus' life. We know that Mary was a faithful disciple because as we get to the end of Jesus' life, we know that she was with him at the cross. And all four Gospels do give accounts of these next three or four different points here. We're going to look at Matthew's account here, Matthew chapter 27, verse 55. It says, and many women were there watching from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee while caring for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Now when it was evening, a rich man from Arimathea came, named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut out in the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. So we see that again, Mary Magdalene was someone that Jesus had helped out. He had cast out 7 demons from her. We see that this would give us the intention that as Jesus is crucified, we see that Mary is right there watching. She was present not just at the time that he was crucified, but there watching the crucifixion. We see that as Jesus' body was placed into the tomb by Joseph, that Mary Magdalene was there to know the spot of where he was buried. She was there all the way through the end. And again, we look at Mark, Luke, and John, all give accounts of this, and that Mary was present. Wording is important here. Present in regards to the death of Jesus. So it appears that she would have been faithful to him from the time of her healing all the way up to this point. And then as we keep reading forward, it says in verse 61, Mary Magdalene was there, knowing where the tomb was. And as we continue, we look at Luke's account here, in Luke 23, verse 55. It says, now the women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. And then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. And on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. So we see that Mary Magdalene, again, not just there for the presence of the death of Jesus, again, saw where he was buried, because she is going to be one of the women that helps to prepare the spices. So as the tradition would have gone at this point in time, the body would have been placed in the tomb. It would have been prepared with certain spices and oils. It would have been properly wrapped, almost like a mummification state. But it's a long process because of the time of where Jesus died. Jesus died on the edge of the Sabbath. It would have been unlawful for them to prepare those spices and to prepare the body going into the Sabbath. So therefore, that's why Mary saw the tomb, so that she knew where to go back to, so that after the Sabbath day, she and some other women could go to properly prepare the body for its permanent resting place. And so in doing that, would have come with the spices and the oils and the wrappings to properly prepare Jesus' body for its long-term resting place. And of course, as we know, Jesus is not going to be there as we go further along. And that leads us to our next point here, and that she witnessed the resurrection. She wasn't just there for the point to where she heard that Jesus wasn't there. She actually saw the resurrection. She saw Jesus herself. And for that, we look at Mark chapter 16, verse 4. It says, in looking up, they noticed that the stone had been rolled away, for it was extremely large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. But he said to them, do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See, here is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. Therefore you will see him just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now after he had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and reported to those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. And when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they refused to believe it. We see here is a woman who has not left Jesus for 1 second as much as possible, only to rest on the Sabbath, which was the commandment at that point in time. She comes back to properly prepare the body with some other women. And in verse 4, it says that looking up, they noticed, you're looking at Mary Magdalene and the other women who have come to properly prepare the body. And yet the stone is not there. And the stone had been heavily guarded by the Romans and by the chief priests, for they did not want the body to be stolen. And so not only was the stone rolling away significant in the fact that it just wasn't there and his body wasn't there, but you're looking at something that was heavily guarded 24/7 and making sure that Jesus' body wasn't stolen to try to use as some kind of proof. As we go back and look at the previous verses here, then that's exactly what would happen here. And yet these women show up, and it says that the stone had been rolled away. Again, an extremely large stone that was heavily guarded, for it's extremely large. And into the tomb saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. No Jesus, no dead body. Only here is what it was described as a young man wearing a white robe. Again, as we go back and we look at the previous passages from the four Gospels, we know what happened. We know that angels came down to roll away the stone. We know that Jesus' body came back to life and that he was resurrected. And Mary Magdalene is the first one to know that. Not just that, but we see that she's also, or at least she's one of the first ones to know it. But as it says in verse 9, it says that he first appeared to Mary Magdalene. So not only did she go to the tomb and was one of the first ones to realize that he wasn't there, but she's actually the first person recorded as actually seeing Jesus as he was resurrected. And we'll look further into one of those passages here in a minute in regards to that conversation between Jesus and Mary, as she realizes and as she sees him for the first time. So she goes to prepare his body. And again, this for me is something that's always been significant. Because for someone to go prepare the body is someone who would be close. It's someone who would have cared for Jesus to the point to where you got to make sure that the body is properly taken care of. And she's one of the few women who has taken on that responsibility. And again, the first one that Jesus appears to after his resurrection. And she goes back to report that. And that brings us to our next point here, in that she reported the resurrection to the apostles. She goes back and she tells them what's going on. And we'll look at John's account for this. John chapter 20, starting at verse 1. It says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb, while it was still dark, and saw the stone already removed from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we do not know where they put him.'" So as we look at the full story here, again, we know that these women go. We know that Jesus is not there. Now, the women had been told what's going on, but they haven't quite believed it. They believed that they had stolen his body. And the conversation between Mary and Peter and what we believe to be John here indicates that they had just feared that they had taken his body. So she reports back to Peter and John here, and that Jesus' body is gone. But as we continue in verse 15, we know that Peter and John go to the tomb to see for themselves. We know that Mary was there. And it says that she was weeping. And it says in verse 15, thinking that he was the gardener, meaning Jesus, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will take him away." But Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Stop clinging to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he has said these things to her. So as we look at John's account of Mary seeing Jesus for the first time, we see a more descriptive account of what's going on here. She's returned back to the tomb with Peter and John, and it says that she was weeping. And a man is talking to her. She believes that it's the gardener, when in all reality it's actually Jesus. And when Jesus says her name, she turns around and realizes who he is. And so she witnesses the resurrection, or rather not necessarily witnesses the resurrection itself, but is witness to Jesus being resurrected. She goes to tell the apostles, and again, we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of that as well, and that she goes to report these things. Mary has talked to Jesus face to face, and now she is gone to report to the other disciples, just as Jesus told her to. We see a woman here that Jesus trusted. A woman here that, again, is going to be a messenger and bring me some of the greatest news that this world had ever had before. And that Jesus, who was brutally beaten and torn on the cross, had risen from the dead and is walking again. As Jesus told her here, I have not yet ascended to the Father, but I will. And so she is going with an all-important message to tell them that he is risen, and with further instructions on what to do next. We're looking at Jesus' last days on this earth. After his resurrection, he is going to give final instructions to the disciples, to his apostles. He's going to be with them for several days until he finally ascends. Again, before he leaves them forever, until they meet in eternity. And Mary was the one that he entrusted with going to send that message. Now, as far as my research, this is about as far as it goes. And if there's a passage or two that I've missed somewhere along the way, then please point that out to me. But this appears to be the majority of what we know about Mary Magdalene. Not a whole lot here, but yet all important. Now, before we get into the points here tonight, and look at why I've chosen Mary Magdalene and why she's important to us as Christians, I do want to look at some of the things that over my lifetime I've heard about Mary Magdalene that are just not true, or maybe we just flat out don't know about. One is the statement of she was a prostitute. All right? Was Mary a prostitute? We knew that Jesus cast out 7 demons, and as I've heard many times in my life, Mary Magdalene was a prostitute that Jesus turned into good. There is no report of this whatsoever. There is no report whatsoever that Mary Magdalene was ever a prostitute or anything along those lines. And again, all we know about her before the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus was the fact that he had taken out 7 demons from her and that she was a disciple of his. We see nothing else from her. According to my research, the myth of the prostitute actually came from the early Catholic Church. And if I'm not mistaken, Pope Gregory was the one that really kind of began to do that. I don't know why. I didn't really dive too deep into that research. But I do know that that's something that pretty much started with the Catholic Church back in its early days, about maybe 300 or 400 years after this. But no, we had no proof whatsoever that Mary was a prostitute. So one thing that during my research was this question right here. And one that I never really heard before was that apparently a lot of paintings that depict Mary have her with extremely long hair. And it goes back to the passage that we see in Luke chapter 7. This is the passage that many people often refer to as this being Mary Magdalene. Luke 7 verse 36 says, Now one of the Pharisees was requesting him to eat with him. And he entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. And when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster vial of perfume. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And she wiped them with the hair of her head, and began kissing his feet and anointing them with the perfume. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. Apparently, there is a misconception here in that this woman is Mary Magdalene. But again, we have no evidence of that whatsoever. Matter of fact, this is actually kind of contradictory as to what we would see with Mary, unless this is early on in her life. The point here is that we have no proof as to who this woman actually is. There's no name given here. There's no indication of her later on that we know of. This is an isolated story here. And as far as we know, it has no ties to Mary Magdalene. Could be, but as far as we know, this is not her. And so, according to the statement, she's a sinner. Again, this is kind of comes to the point of where many have interpreted that to mean prostitute or something along that line. But again, the scriptures give us no indication whatsoever in regards to these statements, in that Mary was a prostitute or anything along those lines. And I'm sure she had long hair, but as far as what she exactly looked like, and as far as her reference to this story, again, there's no proof here that this is who this was. The last thing that I have here is one that I believe is more recent. And that is, was she married to Jesus? I've mentioned this before. I went and saw a movie close to 20 years ago now called The Da Vinci Code. I went with a friend, and if you haven't seen the movie, it's a very exciting story starring Tom Hanks. And it's based around Leonardo da Vinci's painting, The Last Supper. And if you've never seen that painting, first of all, I'll be shocked. But The Last Supper is of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples before he is to be crucified. And they are all sitting in chairs on one side of the table, and depicted in that painting is Mary Magdalene. And as the movie goes along, there are certain clues in the painting that leads to some kind of treasure. And there is one part of the movie where they look at how Jesus and Mary were sitting, and there is a suggestion there that they were married. And not just with the movie, but I've heard this at several points in time in my life. It suggested that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were so close that they were even married, maybe even in secret. We have no proof of that whatsoever. First of all, the painting was painted 1,600 years after this took place. Da Vinci has no idea how they were sitting. As a matter of fact, the painting is false. As we go over the Renaissance with my students, I point that out. And that tradition would be that they were not sitting in chairs, but actually on the ground. So again, Da Vinci was painting off of what he thought might be right, but don't take too much account of that. But it does lead to a lot of rumors in that Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus. And again, we have no proof of that whatsoever. So just looking at some of the storylines that go along with Mary Magdalene, again, this is one of the reasons why I chose her as the first one of this series. And that there have been a lot of things over the years about Mary, many of those in that either they're flat out just not true or we have no proof of whatsoever. So I did want to talk about that before we move on into our final points. So as we close up the lesson tonight, why is Mary Magdalene important? Why did we choose her to start off this series about so many important women in the Bible? Well, first of all, we see that she was healed by Jesus. She is living and walking proof of Jesus' powers as he removed those demons from her. We see that she was one of his disciples. We see that this was a woman who walked with Jesus, as appears at least most days anyway. Even to the point of where she personally funded Jesus and was at the crucifixion and witnessed his death. Jesus had thousands of disciples, as we read about during his ministry. How many of those were present at his death? We don't know. But we know that Mary was one of them. We know that Mary was so close here to where she would have been here to witness the crucifixion of Jesus with his mother and with many others that were very close to him. We see that she helped to prepare spices for his body. And again, we look at that as someone who was not just a disciple of Jesus, but someone who appeared to be faithful to him. Someone who tried to serve him in any way possible, as this was typically reserved for as a job for someone who was close to the family. And that she was the first to see Jesus resurrected and reported to the apostles. What we see here is a woman who is essential in the life of Jesus. We see a woman here who had great faith. Again, from the time that she was healed by Jesus until after the story, and we don't necessarily know what happens to her after this. Again, nothing I can find anyway. But we see here that she was faithful to Jesus all the way through, from the time that she was healed all the way until Jesus' resurrection. And that she was there step by step all the way along the way. See, someone that no matter what the circumstances, that she was faithful to Jesus. And that she was not going to leave his side even in death. She went to the tomb that morning to prepare the body so that even in death, Jesus was taken care of. That his body was properly prepared. And in doing so, becomes the first person to see Jesus. She's entrusted with going to spread the word to the other disciples. Now, again, that's not necessarily something that would have been broadcast above the loudspeakers. Jesus did not necessarily want everyone to know that he was risen from the dead. Because if word gets to the chief priest, gets to the Roman government, then becomes a new hunt to arrest Jesus. So in letting his disciples and apostles know that Jesus was risen from the dead, this was something that, again, he would have trusted with someone that he trusted very well. And that's what we see out of Mary Magdalene. We see a story here of a woman that, again, over the years has become a very interesting character. A lot of misconceptions, but someone who is faithful to the bitter end. And that's someone that we could look at as a great example. And that she walked with Jesus and she stayed with Jesus all the way through. And again, was such a faithful disciple that even during his death, she was there with him. We see a woman here that, again, we can aspire to be like in regards to our faith in Jesus. Are we as faithful to Jesus as Mary was to him? As we close up the lesson tonight, begin this series, again, we look at people that we can look up to in that they did things the right way, at least in regards to what we're told. And I look at the faith of Mary during a time to where, especially during his arrest, during his crucifixion, during his resurrection, if she had been caught as being one of his disciples, what would happen to her? She likely could have seen the same fate, but yet she was faithful all the way to the bitter end. And that's the kind of faith that we need to have in God and in Jesus. That from the beginning to the end, that we are there all the way with him. We know that Jesus has saved all of us. Jesus has healed us from the bonds of sin. Most everyone here denies a Christian. And as we've been baptized into that, we have seen our sins washed away because of the sacrifice of Jesus himself. So we have also been saved and healed by Jesus. But we've got to continue to be faithful all the way to the time that we leave this earth. We've got to walk with Jesus just as Mary walked with him. We've got to be there every step of the way, committing 100%. Not just in good times or in easy times, but every single time. And again, we see a woman here where we see that kind of example. We don't really know what happens to her after this, but again, we see somebody who is faithful. And that's the kind of faith that we need to have as well. So tonight, as we wrap up the lesson, and as we leave for the night, we bring the invitation. If there's someone here tonight who does need to come forward and become a Christian, I think everything is here ready to do that. I believe everyone here tonight is taking those steps. But if there's someone here tonight who has not been as faithful as we need to, if you compare yourself to the kind of faith that Mary had, would you stack up? Are you following Jesus that closely? Are you being as faithful as Jesus as you need to be? Are you serving him? Are you serving God like Mary served? And if we're not, then we need to make sure that we make some changes. Maybe those are a few things here and there that we just need to do a better job of. Maybe that goes back to I've gone too far away from God and I need to come back. Or maybe I just need prayers to help get through a time that I'm going through right now where it's just very tough. No matter what the case may be, don't let tonight's opportunity go wasted. If we can help anyone, please come as we stand and as we sing.